It was a night shrouded in mist, the kind of cold, damp fog that clung to the skin like an unwelcome memory. The cemetery lay still, bathed in the pale light of a waxing moon. Gravestones jutted out from the earth like the jagged teeth of long-forgotten monsters. The iron gate creaked on its rusty hinges as a figure slipped through, unnoticed by the world beyond. Cassandra had never believed in ghosts. At least, that's what she told herself every time she visited the cemetery after dark. She had a job to do, after all. A caretaker's daughter, she had grown up among the stones, learning to tend to the dead as others might tend to a garden. The dead don't speak, her father always said. They don't wander or want anything anymore. They're at peace. But peace was the last thing Cassandra felt as she made her way through the rows of tombstones. The wind, though gentle, carried with it a sound of soft murmur, almost like a distant conversation. She paused, her hand tightening around the small lantern she carried. She had heard stories from the townsfolk about the voices in the cemetery, whispers in the dark that could drive a person mad if they listened too long. Nonsense, she muttered under her breath, her voice trembling despite herself. But the murmur persisted, a soft chorus that rose and fell with the shifting wind. It wasn't the first time she had heard it. For weeks now, these voices had haunted her nightly rounds. They were never clear enough to make out distinct words, just faint echoes that sent chills down her spine. Cassandra continued her walk, passing by graves she had known all her life. Mr. Thompson, the grumpy old man who lived down the road, lay beside his wife, their graves adorned with flowers that had long since wilted. The children from the orphanage, whose stones were marked only by dates, rested in an overgrown corner. She always felt a pang of sadness when she passed them by. But tonight, something was different. The voices were louder, closer, as if they were surrounding her. She stopped in front of a grave she didn't recognize. The name on the headstone was worn and unreadable, but the date of death was too recent. Her father hadn't mentioned any new burials. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as she knelt to inspect the grave more closely. As she touched the earth, the whispers sharpened. Cassandra gasped, yanking her hand back as if burned. The voices were clearer now, no longer distant murmurs, but frantic, desperate pleas. They swirled around her, filling the air with a cacophony of indistinguishable cries. She stumbled backward, dropping the lantern. Its light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the gravestones. "Help us!" The words were unmistakable this time, as clear as if someone had spoken them right next to her. Cassandra's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. She wanted to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground, frozen in place by some unseen force. "Help us," the voices repeated, more insistent now. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the ground beneath her began to tremble. The earth at the base of the unknown grave shifted, and a pale hand burst forth from the soil, fingers grasping at the cold night air. Cassandra screamed, scrambling to her feet as more hands emerged from the ground, not just from the unknown grave but from all around her. The dead were rising, their skeletal hands reaching out, their hollow eyes pleading for salvation. The voices were no longer whispers. They were a chorus of anguish, a symphony of suffering that echoed through the cemetery. Cassandra backed away, her legs weak with terror, but the hands followed, clawing at the earth as the dead pulled themselves from their graves. "Help us," they cried, their voices filled with torment. Cassandra turned and ran, her lantern forgotten. She sprinted through the cemetery, her heart pounding in her ears, the voices chasing her, filling the air with their desperate pleas. She could hear the shuffling of feet behind her, the sound of bones dragging across the dirt as the dead pursued her. She reached the gate, her hands fumbling with the latch, but the iron gate refused to open. The voices were all around her now, closing in, their cold hands brushing against her skin. "We don't belong here," they whispered. "Free us," Cassandra sobbed, her fingers slipping from the latch as she fell to her knees. The dead surrounded her, their hollow eyes fixed on her, their voices merging into a single, agonized cry. "Help us!" With a final, gasping breath, Cassandra closed her eyes. The voices fell silent. The cemetery was still once more, bathed in the cold light of the moon. When the sun rose the next morning, the caretaker found his daughter lying at the gate, her face pale and cold as the grave. The cemetery was quiet, the dead resting peacefully in their tombs, as they always had. The voices had disappeared, their cries for help silenced. But some say that if you visit the cemetery on a misty night, when the wind is just right, you can still hear them, the voices of the dead, calling out for a peace they can never find.